Okay, I'm going to give it a couple more minutes. All right, well, I think we're going to get started. Welcome, everyone. Happy Friday. Thanks for taking the time out of your Friday afternoon for the session. Really appreciate it. Rather than just starting right into this presentation, I did want to jump around a couple places in order to give a little kind of grounding and context that I think is probably important. Since everyone just had a tremendous amount of information dumped in their laps the last couple of days with regards to all the submissions that we saw here. So on this slide, this is the slide we talked about last time, that showing the funnel that every one of the advisory panels is working through. And we meant these numbers here to be illustrative. We thought, oh, well, each panel is probably not going to have 200 broad ideas coming into it. And it turned out that this panel had over 400 ideas come into it. So there you go. Anyway, but this is where we are in the process. And one of the points here is that, intentionally at the start of this process, we really wanted to make sure that we were able to get as many ideas as possible from a bunch of different angles. And so we had listening tours, the submission form, the panel itself can come up with ideas throughout the process in terms of needs assessments, government agencies. So lots of ideas coming into the funnel. And this is, this and healthcare and education are probably the two broadest areas. So where we are here is we're just at the point that we've gotten all those submissions, those ideas in. And the team has been kind of working behind the scenes very quickly, day and night, to try and kind of categorize them and start looking at some themes and putting them into some context. So a big point about that here is we didn't give you all these submissions and expect everyone to have read them and we're going to make decisions about them today. So put everyone at ease. It was just a matter of, hey, let's see if we can get them into the process in the second meeting with some categorization, some structure around them, so that people can start wrapping their heads around them early. So that's what I wanted to say on this slide. You can go to slide 10. So that being said, good news, still fairly early, got a bunch of rich information. The flip side of that is, and it's great actually that, we've gotten this much engagement, but, when you look at the breadth and depth of submissions that we've gotten, and, and once again, just because it's a submission, a place in a certain area gets the most submissions doesn't necessarily mean that is the area that would be of the most strategic importance. That's going to be up to the advisory panel to decide. But it does give you a pretty good feeling for places where there is a lot of energy. And like I said, there are over 400 submissions. So, there's going to be a lot for this advisory panel to work through, both in terms of thinking about submissions, but even a little bit more so in terms of thinking about which areas are probably the highest areas of strategic focus to think about in terms of things that are going to be within the ARPA guidelines and against the guiding principles that can create value for Kansas and drive it forward from an economic revitalization standpoint. And the other thing is, and I think that we had a lot of this in the last session, and I was really impressed with it, there's going to need to be a lot of kind of integrated thinking. Everyone here has a certain perspective that they come at things from. Some people may have more expertise in housing or certain areas of business or thinking about workforce issues. Or in order for this, it's great that everyone brings their expertise. But when increasingly over the course of this exercise, everyone's also going to need to have their kind of integrated thinking hat on, because the panel is going to need to be able to make some strategic decisions about the places where you want to focus kind of most of your effort going forward. And our role as a support group is to help provide you with the information and the support and some of the frameworks to kind of work through that process. So we're here for you for that. So with that being said, let's go back up to the that first slide. And before I kick off now and start walking through things, just wonder whether Representative Tarwater or Tian, you'd want to, have any thoughts or coaching guidance kind of going into this.
Well, I'm interested to see what everybody thought of all the submissions. And I had asked before a lot of people were on here, what if we have staff on this committee, and it appears we do, but I'd like to find out a background on how many federal dollars have been given to the local authorities. It looks like a lot of the local areas are trying to supplant some of their budget with some of these funds. And I just want to know how much we've already given them from a state level. And a lot of the requests are also in our budget right now that we're considering. That's what I've been doing all morning. I was in appropriations, and a lot of these housing requests and such are already in our budget. So I'd like to kind of get our arms around that to get started with.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, there's definitely going to be, and that is even built into the guiding principles from the Spark Executive Committee is, there's a probably unique sweet spot for these funds, and let's focus them in on the areas that are the sweet spot, given allowability, but also given, which of these areas have other sources of funding.
So Representative Tarwater, to answer your question, this is Alicia Johnson Turner with the Recovery Office. As far as local funds, so for the American Rescue Plan, there's about $1 billion given to locals. So that would include the 105 counties, the 10 major metropolitan cities, and 615 non-entitlement units, which are basically the any incorporated city. So the units of government that didn't get money would be like rural water districts, townships, those sorts of things. And then there was $400 million given last year in CARES Act or Coronavirus Relief Fund dollars. That was the states that came out of the states $1.034 billion. And that money went to all 105 counties. Some of those shared money with their cities and local units of government within their jurisdictions, others did not. So that would be the main pieces of the big dollars that have gone to locals in Kansas. Does that answer your question?
It's a good start, yes.
And one of the questions on the submission forms actually did ask, once again, it was self-reported, whether there are any other sources of funds for those areas. But yeah, we can do that overlay as we go forward. Any thoughts on your end, Tian?
Nothing new compared to what Representative Tarwater said. For me on the private sector side, I'm just not as engaged in regards to what funds the different municipalities have had. And I just wanted to make sure that we use these one-time dollars to create and stimulate new things, new ideas, new industries, versus offset some budget shortfalls or to add into a pot that has already been given into from the state or county or city level for any projects that are going on. So I'm not saying that would exclude them from getting it, but I do know that there's organizations and programs in place at the state level already to help support some of these ideas. And as these come up, I just want to make sure that we can get that clarification.
Sure. Great. Well, in terms of the broader discussion that you were talking about, Representative Tar, I'd suggest we actually start walking through, and I promise this time I'll try and spend not much time talking on my end and begin having some discussions around each one of the areas of the panel itself around their thoughts about what they had seen or the areas that have kind of bubbled to the surface. So with that, on the next slide, once again, leading off with kind of the purpose of today, do a lot more of the brainstorming around the particular areas. And then we're also going to spend a little time talking about how we filter and we think about filtering and topic prioritization. And I think we already have started getting into that discussion, but I think we have the potential for a more robust discussion at the end. Talk about kind of where we're going next, because there's going to be a decent amount of homework that we're going to need to work between the support team and the panelists, and the exit survey is even going to kind of link into that. So on this slide, if you look at kind of where we are in the process, just as a reminder, we're in the meeting number 2, and meeting number 3 is probably going to be in the early March timeframe. So right now we're at that kind of top part of the funnel. We've gotten all the submissions. We've added that to how we talked about the areas of need before, and we've begun slotting these things in together. And so we're right at the point where we can start getting into a little bit more substantive conversations around some of those areas. But once again, we haven't yet, although we will soon begin kind of fleshing out some of the more, certainly the high priority areas that we want to look at in more detail, even as we go through the submissions. Go to the next slide. This slide is something that we've been kind of working on to kind of try and portray how we're trying to work towards the answer. And this is something that's a little bit of a unique wrinkle, particularly on this set of funds, but let me walk through it. So in the first session, we really talked about focus areas. And then we started identifying some of the needs in those focus areas. The sweet spot that we're eventually getting to is going to be around kind of programmatic areas. In some cases, a program looks more like a traditional program, and some it may look like groupings of projects or an individual project. But we're using the submissions, and the submissions really weren't necessarily asking for projects. They were asking for ideas to come at the level that we think, are the broad themes that the panel itself wants to be able to prioritize. Once again, within those themes will be some specific ideas and projects that need to be looked at. But we're kind of we've been working the problem around thinking about prioritization from the left to the right. And now that we have the submissions, we can start working on it from the right to the left, flying at that sweet spot level. So this is a little bit more of a natural way to think about it in a place like, healthcare and education, where you tend to think about things more as programs. When you get into areas like efficiency and modernization and economic revitalization, it ends up being sometimes kind of a combination of what you typically think of as a program versus what you might think of as a project. And so we're going to need to figure out how to be as flexible as possible to think about both things, or you will, in the context of this panel. Go to the next slide. The other things that we're going to need to be thinking about is, in terms of prioritizing, are once again the guiding principles from the SPARC Executive Committee, as well as the allowability rules. The guiding principles from SPARC Executive Committee, I'll go through them in a bit, but they're important to really keep top of mind at all times, because, as the Spark Committee is going to be getting ideas from each one of the panels, there's going to be more ideas that, in totality than can be funded. And so as they think about making trade-offs and making decisions, certainly things that are hewing the most closely to the guiding principles that they've laid out are the ones that are going to have a natural advantage in that discussion. Once again, we'll revisit those in a second. In terms of allowability, can't use the funds unless they're an allowable use. And so it's very kind of clear cut, what's on either end of the spectrum of always allowable and never allowable. There are a lot of things in the center, conditions around which something may be allowable. The thing to know there is, and I'll talk about those a little bit later too, but the thing to know is that, we have expertise within the support group that has already started looking at each one of those submissions to be able to give a view of definitely allowable, definitely not allowable, potentially allowable, and maybe whether it's even leaning to being likely allowable or likely not. In some cases, it's going to depend upon, getting some more information from the people who submitted just to understand, because they might have submitted things that have multiple elements to them or are unclear. Or it could be that they were clear, but if you kind of crafted, the program or the idea in a certain way, it's more likely to become allowable. And that is probably, the allowability piece is probably this panel, just because of the nature of the area that it's covering. It's probably the most impactful for this panel, just up front. So we got the most submissions, but the allowability issue is going to be the most impactful here. So if you go to the next slide with the allowability, I mean, just kind of things that are clearly allowable versus not allowable, always allowable, responding to the public health emergency, addressing the negative economic impacts of COVID pandemic, provide premium pay to essential workers, offset cuts in government services, make investments in specific areas like water, sewer, stormwater, broadband. That's one of the reasons why, since this panel is covering water, we saw an incredible amount of water submissions, probably, right? It's literally explicitly called out here. Not allowable, pretty clear what's not allowable there. This isn't meant to be something that, it is used to kind of offset other things. Conditionally allowable, at a high level, and there's way more nuance to this, is they could be allowable ideas if they offer services or benefits, could be employment, could be other types of benefits for members of disproportionately impacted communities, populations in qualified census tracts, services addressing health disparities, communities disproportionately impacted by the pandemic, or sectors such as travel, tourism, hospitality. And one thing to keep in mind, because I asked this question and it was kind of defined in the final rule, industries are disproportionately impacted if they experience greater than 8% employment loss. So something to think about if we're wanting to kind of like expand our thinking beyond the ones that are listed here, right? To say, where could there be runways? We're going to need to be able to think about those types of things, and we will be. Go to the next slide. So the other thing I would bring up, just to kind of reiterate, we'll probably kind of reiterate this on every single one of the sessions, is that the top guiding principle is prioritize sustainable programs, investments through one-time use of funds versus substantial expansion of existing services. So that links into Tien, what you had said, right? Making a catalytic investment. And even on some things that are catalytic investments, I think we have to be careful to understand, to the extent there are any kind of trailing costs or requirements that could potentially go with that. The other point that Representative Tarwater was bringing up was understanding, is there, where is the sweet spot for these funds? Can we combine with or leverage local and agency funds to maximize use of discretionary funds? So that could be making sure equal skin in the game. It could also be looking at, well, Some projects may just be better suited by the local funds, right? Particularly areas that had gotten a lot of local funds. The big one, fostering long-term systemic impact for Kansans and considering equitable opportunities and outcomes. Obviously, for the allowability, we have to think about that on the criteria that we were given, but we're also going to need to think about, for instance, geographic equity. And we did ask in the submission forms, what parts of Kansas the submission would bring benefit to. Once again, self-reported at this point. In terms of fostering long-term systemic impact for Kansans, thinking about long-term impact over time, but probably also thinking about, which solutions are point solutions, not to say all point solutions are bad, and which solutions are things that might be able to have broader impact, for instance. And those are the types of things we're going to consider when we get into the scoring matrix. The last two, ensure flexibility with the investment strategies and ensure results are measurable and track, are going to also be important considerations for the SPARK committee. So once again, there will probably be a little bit of a competition of ideas and funds at that level, given the 4 panels. And so each panel should be thinking about that for sure. So the next slide really is just kind of a summary of, when you put all this together, how do we ensure investments foster long-term systemic impact across the areas underneath this panel? And then kind of really thinking, where can you make, with one-time investments, have catalytic impact on a broad scale, right? That's probably the sweet spot of what you want to think here, so long as it's an area that, falls within the allowability guidelines. So, on the next one, we're going to start now diving into, each one of the areas where we got submissions. I'm going to be interested to kind of getting your thoughts. But before we kind of dive in there, I would like to open it up. I've done enough talking for 20 minutes or so. Just given what we've gone through, any thoughts about the kind of exercise ahead of the panel?
The allowability questions, which I understand the staff is, I think, currently assessing the submissions against those criteria, are really interesting to me when we're talking about communities and sectors. I mean, when we're talking about a community, is that literally a city or county in the state of Kansas? And is there a list of communities that we know are eligible and a list of communities that are not? And the same thing with sectors. You listed some examples of sectors that apparently are in the allowable bucket, but I'm just wondering if that's a known thing, that now the staff is just checking all the submissions against that, and or is that subject to our interpretation in terms of which communities meet the criteria or sectors meet the allowability criteria?
No, they need to be, kind of, objectively based, and the staff has been working on that, particularly kind of the experts around it. And there are a list of geographies, which we'll eventually be able to share pretty quickly. There, demographic communities as well to think about there. The 3 sectors were the ones listed, but the question would be, are there any other sectors that might qualify? That area is going to be, the challenge here. But I don't know, Matt, are you on the call? Would you want to kind of elaborate there, since you're the expert around allowability?
I'm not sure I'm the expert, but so there, in the Treasury final rule, there are presumptively eligible activities where Treasury has just come out point blank and said, projects within qualified census tracts, which are a HUD designated area, are allowable. They've also said, these are impacted industries. That's the travel, tourism, hospitality. But then, where it gets gray is there's a lot of flexibility in local determination. So, in the state of Kansas, what are impacted industries or impacted communities? So you have this presumptively eligible from Treasury, but then, Kansas has some discretion to apply it to local circumstances and come up with some of our own definitions.
But Matt, just to follow up, but they would expect to see kind of what the objective data was that was used to.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, no, it's not arbitrary and capricious, decisions. It's based on something, based on some rationale. And so even the concept of qualified census tracts, Kansas has quite a few, but not as many as maybe a more urban state. But you have rural communities or food deserts or lack of access to primary health care or certain circumstances like that would be applicable here in the state.
And see, so for the other three panels, connectivity is broadly explicitly in. Healthcare and education is too. Well, certainly healthcare for sure, or most aspects of it, as well as efficiency and modernization. This is the panel where more of the things fit into that middle bucket and how that middle bucket gets defined.
John, at some point, it may be also helpful for this panel to be able to see the list of projects broken down by geographic representation.
Yep.
That could probably look in a number of different ways, visually on a map or broken down by congressional districts or counties. But I think having that view at some point would be helpful just to see the spread of requested projects across the state.
Yep. We'll do that. Sam, you're talking to a bunch of consultants and ex-consultants and asking them to sort and portray data. So just bring it on.
I guess I've been thinking about this for the last week or so. And so I just want to put it out there, and I won't talk too long. And I'm probably the least experienced government person here, right? So this is all a little bit new to me. I haven't been in the private sector my entire life. This whole process, though, is seen, I think, in an effort to gain consensus or gain this community involvement, which I think is really important. To me, the last experiences we went through this past week felt like an exercise where a lot of individuals that knew that we were on this board were asking to get their projects that maybe weren't approved before the normal governmental process to get them stuck into this effort in some way. And in some ways, it seemed contrary to what I think we were originally asked to do, which is look at really big, bold, innovative projects that can change the economy and the environment of Kansas for years to come. I just think big ideas, innovation economy and putting a fund together around ag and cybersecurity, renewables, housing. We talked originally about education and broadband and the beauty of Kansas ag. And I guess a little bit of my just experience, I'm just being candid and honest, felt like this was something that I didn't really understand how to facilitate well, and wasn't big, bold ideas to do really meaningful things for decades to come. It was a lot of requests to get a piece of the funding process. And I guess, and maybe I just misunderstood that, maybe I mishandled it, but it seems to me that this is the moment for this advisory board to really be bold and to hear what everybody's saying, but also almost independent of that, bring forth some really big, meaningful ideas and have them maybe shot down or talked about, but not go through this process of harvesting through 800 submissions for this and set the North Star, I guess, for lack of a better term. Maybe I'm alone on that, and so I apologize if I am, but that's just, again, I'm learning as I do this, and this was a unique experience for me.
Well,
welcome to government.
Yeah. Well, you know what? I've never gone through a process exactly like this as well. I think what you were talking about, the two dynamics aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. And that's a little bit on the slide where we talked about kind of those programmatic areas. And we said, look, we're working from the left to the right, starting with needs and starting with things that could be big ideas. And then we're working from the right in terms of looking at the submissions and understanding specific projects. The panel itself is going to need to there's going to be allowability aside, more things than could be funded. And so the panel is going to need to decide, are there some big programmatic, big bets to make? And if you could get them through allowability, that's the way to focus. The intent was never, this was just going to be an approval exercise for, everything came in. And in some cases, the submission process really was looking more for ideas necessarily than just specific projects. It's totally within the purview of the panel to go whichever way it wants to and bring whatever kind of transformative or creativity it wants to bring to this area, and we can support it in that as well. There are some, I'm content neutral, I'm just facilitating this, but when you do look at, research around, the things that would have driven state economies, GDP growth the most over the years, it's, entrepreneurial and innovation ecosystem, number of patents. So, if you really want to come at it from, what could be the longest pole in the tent for a really long period of time, that's one area, come at it from that angle. Nevertheless, there is a lot of wisdom to come from, crowdsourcing a lot of ideas as well. And some of those ideas may get funded if the thing that they're targeting makes a lot of sense to drive the economy. So never said it was going to be easy, but we're kind of coming at it from both angles, partially because both of those things were always built into the process, even before I came on board. So. But anyway, I just talked a lot, I'm interested in other people's thoughts on that.
Hey, Matt, this is Tim. I want you to know that what you said resonated with me, and I too went into that. I'm adapting a little bit, but I too went into this with what catalytic investments can we make for our state. But I see, obviously, there's a lot of need, and I still need to discuss further. There's two things that really jumped out at me was I didn't realize we had such a water issue in our state. I guess I'm spoiled and take it for granted. And then secondly, from a housing perspective, I would just love for someone on our panel, once the appropriate time is, to just help me answer or help me understand the shortage of housing that we have. Is it more of affordable housing that people could buy, or is there just nowhere to live at all? Because I see a lot of those submissions, but for me, I think being a private, like you, Matt, I'm a private sector guy. That's all I've ever been in. I'm trying to figure out, if there's that great of a need, where are the local GCs, the residential GCs at in those areas? What's preventing them from making it happen and just going out and building it themselves? So definitely have some questions, and would love any input from all the other ED folks that are on here that would have the appropriate answers for their counties when it's the appropriate time. I don't know if that's part of the brainstorming part of the agenda, John, or if that's underneath the discuss step 3.
Yeah, I think for this session, because to be fair, not everyone would have had time to go through all the submissions. We will talk through them one at a time and get perspectives, and it's probably more so kind of logging the areas we want to kind of dive deep on more, right? And the other, I said, to Matt's point, the other thing that I suspect the panel is going to need to do over time is across all those 400 submissions, you could take the approach of either looking at every single one and saying, what do we think of the individual submission? The other thing you could do is say, if I'm working from the left to the center to those program ideas, which are the biggest places for us to focus? And may turn out that only 100 of the submissions actually slot into those areas, right? So you're starting with a strategy as opposed to just looking at everything individually as a project. But in the areas of focus, we can certainly bring more information to the table. At this point, we don't need to make any decisions about that stuff, so we still have some time to do that. And we'll be there to support you at your request in whatever area you want.
Thank you, John.
I appreciate Matt's comments and the focus on this topic. I think it's important to wrestle with, beyond just this meeting. I do think there's something to be said for how you define communities and the people who are being served with the projects that are being put forward. There are some on the face that I would say, well, that's not a transformative project for the state. But if you look at the population being served with some of the
Mhm.
requests,
Sure.
there are some transformative projects that are put forward for the community that they propose to impact. And so
Mhm.
I think we have to balance sort of
Yep.
really big picture impacts with communities that are proposed to be served, and how would those projects or programs impact really at the local level those affected people.
Mhm. Yep. Geographic equity is pretty important.
John, this is Andrew in Wichita. I'll jump in too. I'll agree with everything that's been said. And Sam, I think you characterized that and summarized that very well. And Matt, I agree. I think almost everyone on the panel would agree with the notion of kind of catalytic and major investments. And to the senator's comment and question in the chat earlier about making sure we have clear line of sight on what other tools and funding streams are out there. I think it behoove us all to have a perspective there. Just a couple of comments or thoughts or questions that I had. Obviously, I'm like everyone. I didn't go through them all in great detail, but the broad spectrum and wide variety of the proposals took me a little bit by surprise. I knew there would be a lot of submissions, but just the sheer variety of types of projects and costs and impact was interesting to see. And clearly, this process was meant to be just preliminary. There's not a lot of depth or a lot of meat on those, and obviously this process will work that out. But I would like to see more. Also, I had some questions, and again, for another time or later as we dive into this, some of these proposals clearly seem to me to be, I don't know if it was screened off in terms of submitting to the economic revitalization panel, but some of there's hospital projects. There's some others that I would assume would clearly be realigned into some of the other panels, and vice versa. I'm sure there's some proposals in those other panels that might be a better fit for economic revitalization. So for the staff, I guess that's one kind of question / caveat that I would make. And then I know Matt spoke to the allowability question, but I definitely have some more questions from my vantage point of, I know it's a gray area to be sure, but the distinctions between likely allowable and potentially allowable and somewhat allowable. There's, quite frankly, there's just some that just don't make sense. There's some water projects in this case that were, seem to be allowable, and in other cases they weren't. And I know that has to do with what he outlined with geography, but to me, we're going to do this justice and really give these a good review. We're going to have some more distinction around exactly what that allowability criteria is and how the staff screen those off.
Sure.
That's my thoughts.
And we will keep in mind, they've only had like a day and a night basically to do that. And so that was, kind of
Totally get it.
With all the stuff that had come in. The other thing to note is there's been a little bit of triaging around it, but basically, every submitter was asked to check which panel does this go into and was given a description of what fell into under each panel's purview. So my guess is the first cut at this was saying, okay, let's sort by what, where people self-selected. There will be some going in probably and looking at trading off some things. One area in particular where we specifically put things into this panel was, even though there is a panel that is health and education, things that had to do with requests about like innovation parks and stuff like that, the innovation ecosystem at higher ed institutions, we put here because we felt that there was just so much the nature of that opportunity and so much of a stronger tie to the business realm that it probably fit better against the topics here and probably even with the panelists here, to be honest with you. All right.
I think if I could, and I promise I'll get off this subject.
No, man, it's awesome. We want more discussion. That's awesome.
When I think about big investments, and there's a bunch of stuff, right, that we could do. I think about the experience we've had here in Kansas City. We have a local fund that raised $21 million of local high net worth people, right? It's made 35 investments in Kansas City. Thousands of jobs have come into Kansas City, hundreds of millions of dollars from coastal money into Kansas City.
Yep.
Because of that, they're going to return the entirety of that fund in 2 of the 35 investments.
Mm-hmm.
And using that as a parallel, we've got hundreds of millions of dollars coming into Kansas. Can we do something really meaningful? Set up a fund that co-invests with other funds to invest in Kansas businesses around things that has catalytic, sustainable, long-term impact for generations, instead of, contemplating going through all these things to think about, like, where are we going to push this money? And again, I'm not trying to be disrespectful at all. I'm trying to understand the role of this and, what we could do with this money, and is that even feasible to do with that money? But it seems if we're looking for really bold ideas, I guess I don't know where to source those through, or have a discussion about that, even if it's a dumb idea. I'd be fine with that. But I'm just trying to learn my place and what we're supposed to be bringing forward and when and how.
Matt, the thing I'd say for this, this panel needs to decide kind of how it wants to have its discussions and make decisions. But, my guess is that probably, people who are afraid of putting out, being big ideas probably never come up with any big ideas. So, from my standpoint, I think it's great for the discussion. The thing I'll say is, once again, the submission form has closed, but the panel itself, as we go through this, can create ideas, right? And so that is actually the intent. That's the only way you're going to be able to look at the submissions and come up with some creativity, right? It may be grouping some of those ideas together, or taking a few ideas and linking up some needs and coming up with a bigger idea. Don't know whether all of them are going to be, some might be a stretch to be allowable, but everyone on the panel was selected to be on this panel because of their ability to contribute to those types of discussions. So.
John, this is Lana. If I could just say, this is very much, as you have said a couple of times, we crowdsource for these ideas, right? But there are people who put a significant amount of time and thought into their submissions. And while I don't disagree that I want this to be hugely impactful, I feel we owe it to those folks who took the time and put in the effort to submit those. So I would strongly caution us from just discounting without really looking at what those submissions were.
I totally agree. And like I said on that slide where we talked about coming at it from the left and from the right, it wasn't from one or the other. It was both, right? And even on when we come up with those kind of areas of focus, if someone's submissions were in those areas, that's something that, through a follow-on procurement process, right, we'd focus on, after structuring the program. So, but point taken. Any other thoughts, or can we start diving into some of the focus areas and talking about kind of the complexion of the submissions that came in?
Hey, John, it's Brian. I would just chime in my first flush of the 414. There's some that are very professionally done. They've hired, that they have in staff or in office folks that know how to do this. And then there's some applications that are very much done by a layperson. So I will, I guess, ask you and the Spark staff, if we start separating these into different groups, we need more details on some of the applications that may be lighter on their submissions. You all will do that legwork for us, correct? If we just have additional questions and need to wrestle around with what the application is, or do we just have what we have and that's what we're running with?
If it's something where we feel like, based on what's there, that it's an idea of interest, but it just hasn't been fleshed out, we will go back to the submitter and ask them for additional information or kind of work with them through it. Is that good? It was always our intent that we would do that, particularly even more so as ideas got down that priority funnel. Because there isn't enough information in those submission forms to kind of take them all the way to kind of where they need to be. Let's go into slide 10. Once again, talked about this, an incredible amount of, just breadth and frankly, in a lot of areas, depth. You noted, water and sewer infrastructure. One of the reasons why that one's so big is probably because it's a need, but also because it's explicitly allowed, right? So a lot of people probably would have honed in on that. But, across a number of different areas, and we'll get into the details and have discussions around them shortly. A lot of submissions in all those areas. Like I said, Lona, to your point, we need to look at them all. But the panel has an opportunity to kind of look through and decide where to focus, because there's no way that it's going to be able to prioritize everything, right? So there needs to be some sort of a rubric created to think about each one of these areas, as well as the proposals, and also to think about any additional ones that may have been missed from the submissions. So,
Hey, John, something that may also be good to add as a data point, even within these categories on the slide that you have pulled up, is of each of those submission buckets, what was the subtotal of requests associated with those? So of the 70 housing submissions, what was the total amount requested for housing?
dollars.
In dollars, yeah.
Yeah, we can do that. Go to the next slide. So, we've touched on this a little bit, a lot of this information was on the other slide, except beginning to break down, what fell into business and workforce and housing and each one of the other areas. And so you can see here the groupings, kind of the subcategories of what, just as things were coming in, trying to find ways of being able to put similar theme things together, right? And what we're going to do going forward, so we'll have just a discussion around the focus area business and those identified needs that we'll break out a little bit more detail. And so we'll spend a little bit of time on each one of those 5 focus areas with the panel talking about it. So rather than belaboring it here, this was really just a matter of kind of directionally helping people understand based on how things are bucketed now. Once again, had like short time to really bucket them. Based on a submission form closing recently, this is how they bucket it. But let's go to slide 12. And, the way to approach this exercise is, so this is for, what was bucketed as just a general business category. And the 4 needs under it were industry support with a description of kind of what theoretically would be in those types of programmatic areas that might support that, and kind of some sample of what submissions could have looked like in that area to give a little bit more flavor to it. Innovation and entrepreneurship, tourism, sector support, and cybersecurity. So what I'd suggest is, why doesn't everyone spend like the next 3 minutes, 4 minutes, just kind of reading through it, thinking about it a little bit, and maybe like at 2:51, let's kind of reconvene with the discussion and talk about, just to engage people in kind of integrated thinking, what are your reactions, thoughts about this? Are you surprised? Are there some things that may be missing? How do you think about the relative emphasis of some of these things? And, just any other kind of reactions you have at this level to the information. All right. I guess I just open it up, any kind of thoughts or reactions as you look at this? Any things that really, areas that, really kind of align to your thinking or anything else?
John, I'll throw in. I was just going to say that a lot of these seem very, and probably go to Matt. What Matt has said, it's very superficial. Very short term, which I think personally, I'd like to see all the short term, ideas kind of be weeded out, just in my mind, and then maybe look at some of the longer transformative things, which is kind of what we've always talked about in my mind, that we're supposed to come out of this. And even some from my own community that I would say that don't necessarily meet that long-term transformative issue in my mind.
Got it. Any other thoughts?
So I just looked up my Excel spreadsheet. I'm at submission 102. And so I know I have a little bit ways to go, but I'm hoping in the other 300 or so, there's something about an incentive package for us to draw. And I'm obviously selfish here to the city of Wichita, but even for our state, like Wichita is the air capital of the world, right? And I'm surprised we're not going after the EV side of that. I mean, I see like these little niche type companies coming up in like Englewood, Colorado and things. And I'm like, why? We have the infrastructure here. We have the supplier base that could pivot towards that. Maybe Sam can give me some insight since he's with Spirit, but what I would have loved to seen, and hopefully it's in one of those 300. And if they're not, back to your comment, John, about like, hey, how do we go after things like that? Bring ideas that aren't submitted so that we could go pursue those.
Yeah, it's totally within the purview of the advisory panel to go whatever direction it wants to the point before. We do have to do the due diligence around what's been submitted, but this doesn't, the work of the panel doesn't need to be limited to that. So just to make sure I understood what you said, Tim, I thought I heard you say ag at one point and then say EV. Did I just miss you?
No, EV, so Wichita is the air capital of the world, right? You got all your a lot of major OEMs here. And I know there's different businesses transferring. I mean, you look at the automotive industry, huge EV transformation. And so aircraft should be the same.
Got it. Okay, electric vehicles. Got it. Yep. All right, before we move on to the next one, any other closing thoughts on this? Your chance to get any of your thoughts in right now.
Well, I'll throw in, John, this is Andrew. In terms of kind of all the questions for discussion, they're missing and surprises, but we've kind of hit on those. But I guess where my mind goes is I think Lana made a good point. We need to give a really good, honest due diligence on all the submissions because they all could be catalytic and impactful in one way or another. But where my mind goes is around the industry and innovation realm, for lack of a better word. I mean, I think, the title of this committee is Economic Revitalization. Our economy is built on our private sector industries, the core industries that make up our great state. And there's a wide variety of them. Jan, you make a good shout out to the aerospace sector, and Sam can speak to that better than I can, but that's not clearly the only, by any stretch of the imagination, the only sector of our state's good economy. So in my mind's eye, I'm going to be, I think, processing and chewing on how do we advance our industries through innovation and entrepreneurship and all these supports. And maybe how does that include workforce development and housing and those key inputs that help our industries. But I think we missed the mark. We missed this great opportunity if we don't really think, how do we propel our state's economy forward as opposed to just some Band-Aids.
Well, and one thing I'll say to that, Ed, staying content neutral myself, but one thing we did share as a resource at the start was a link to the kind of very high level summary of the framework for growth from Commerce. And that a lot of the themes in there were around, how to take into account, kind of our current industries and potential industries in the future, but, how do you build them from an innovation standpoint and grow them? So.
Yeah, and I would just remind us all that our existing employers deserve our support, and certainly the biggest concern we hear from them is enough people. And it's not that we have people not working, it's that we simply have a population problem. So I think we have to have an eye towards the future of growing the state versus being one of the top states for folks leaving.
Yep. Yeah, good point.
If I could go back and touch just briefly on Tim's question. I think, Andrew, Lana, Tim, some of you who have more experience on the economic development side on this panel, certainly than I do. But I think the reality is you're going to have a lot of, I'll say, projects being pursued, right, by a range of businesses where they wouldn't necessarily feel comfortable submitting an application for business pursuit being chased, where there's real opportunity for some transformative things to come to the state or the region, just because of the nature of non-disclosures and things like that, where they have to be careful, right? And so submitting an application, like to the Spark Committee, we're probably not seeing a lot of things that we could see that we might otherwise have invested in, and I'm not sure how you get around that, but that's the reality, I think, of having a list like this that eventually is probably going to be public. You're going to have people holding back because they're not going to want to violate NDAs or kind of put information out that's going to give competitors an edge on what they're chasing.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Thank you, Sam.
But we can bring other pieces of information in that maybe not be as good as being able to appear in all of their minds, but hopefully help us think through this too. So any thoughts on other information sources or experts we should bring to the process? It's up to you. We'll try and make that happen.
Hey, John, as you wrap up this slide, I want to be mindful of the feedback we got from our previous meeting about like a 5-minute break. So once you wrap this up, can we take a 5-minute break for the team?
Yeah, we had the 5-minute break a lot longer in the slides, but I'm fine with doing a 5-minute break because we've had a lot of great conversations. We're an hour into it. You guys deserve a 5-minute break. So why don't we do a 5-minute break now? So see everyone at 3:05. All right, get ready to start in about a minute. Why don't you move the slide ahead to the next area? Great, thanks. Folks ready to get started again?
Sure.
All right. Well, the next area is workforce. And so before I give you guys some time to talk about this one, this kind of brings up one of the interesting dynamics and balancing acts for this panel. It reminds me of when I came to work here in Texas about 15 years ago. My boss, who was the CEO of the company, said, it's really easy, because this is Texas, so he talked with the twang. It's really easy for anyone to optimize in the short term, but optimize for the long term. It's doing the same time. It's the hard thing. That's why I hired you, so no pressure. That's the challenge here too, right? There are lots of needs and opportunities kind of to focus on in areas like workforce that are pressing needs into the future as well, but they're enablers now, as well as things around innovation and entrepreneurship and more kind of foundational ecosystem opportunities too. So obviously, I just projecting out, I bet, the panel is going to need to wrestle with that and how to think about, if it wants to play in both areas and or to what extent in each area and where. So anyway, why don't you take like 3 minutes, kind of look through this, think about it a little bit, and then let's have a discussion around workforce. So I guess anyone want to open it up? Any observations about this? Certainly drew a good amount of interest in terms of focus from the submissions. And workforce is pretty much an issue that just about every organization needs to be focused on. So.
Yeah, this is Lana again. I just want to remind us that I am all about upskilling and reskilling folks, but when we're not increasing the number of workers to the supply, we're really only serving to damage employers that have those folks employed now. So we have to be mindful as we consider those types of submissions that we're creating a hole somewhere else if we seek to fill that hole. So I think we have to be mindful that we need to balance that with legitimate retention and recruitment opportunities on the other end of that. And then, as far as the pay stuff, I get it. It's included as allowable. I'm a little bit challenged by that. Just, our economy is really, really strong. There are huge opportunities. We have as a state, we have a very much essential economy. Between agriculture and aerospace, certainly, but that bothers me a little bit. I guess I'm not probably going to jump all over those mechanisms to pay existing employee base. more.
I tend to agree with all that. We discussed that at quite extent today in Appropriations Committee, where we have temporary pay increases. There's no such thing as a temporary anything in government. And if these employers need money for a temporary pay increase, if they can't sustain that with their business, then they aren't in business. Because once you give it to someone, you can't then cut their pay in a year because the economy is back to normal.
Yeah, I was just going to add, I mean, that category in my view has changed significantly. 12 months ago, 18 months ago, this would have been a different conversation. But as we're looking prospectively, that category has a lot less appeal to me now.
Mm-hmm. Even when you look at the impacted industries, if you have a target around the level of staffing loss, it seems like a lot of the sectors have come back.
One question that I have in reviewing specifically the workforce component here, and it actually jumps up to Senator Clays's question in the chat box. There looks like there's a lot of public organizations, whether it's a Department of Commerce, Department of Labor, Department of Ag, a community college. It looks like there's a lot of public requests coming in on the workforce front. Do they have another pot of money, whether it's base or existing Spark money that the state already has ownership of, that we as a Spark sub-advisory don't need to necessarily duplicate or compete with something that's already been appropriated?
They certainly do.
Yeah, I mean,
to that point too, Ryan, I think there's going to be a lot of these that when we're looking at them, we're going to be able to see that there are other sources that maybe are better suited. We have, as we've said, it may seem broad, but we have a pretty narrow scope that we can work within. And it feels to me like this committee is really focused on making truly impactful changes and not one-off programming, short-term. The way those typically work, we go hire somebody with those funds, and we eat up all those funds with administrative work, and often the folks who we're attempting to serve aren't getting the full benefit of those dollars anyway. I would agree wholeheartedly that that's one of those areas we need to really have a rifle approach and not a shotgun approach.
Mm-hmm. Well, the good thing is these are the types of discussions and eventually determinations that the panel is going to need to make, right? There are just so many areas in order to be able to just looking at the submissions and all the other ideas that come up in terms of where the money could be prioritized. But it does seem like, to the extent that you kind of make some of these calls around areas of focus, once again, look at every submission. It may be that a bulk of the submissions really don't fit when you think about strategically how you want to focus, but that's up to the panel to decide.
I will say that workforce development is the one thing I hear most about as the Commerce Chair. It's a big issue, and we actually have. I had a presentation a few weeks back. We actually have more people working in Kansas than we did before the pandemic. And so it is a lot what Lana said. We need to get people here. One source is our colleges, our graduates. 62% of them leave the state. We got to find a way to keep them here in the state and working for companies. And so that's a big issue.
Two pieces, just in my limited experience, I've seen work with those areas, and one's really limited, but I know Rogers, Arkansas took a pretty targeted approach to incentivize, especially during COVID. A lot of technology workers can work from home, and so they incentivized, I think it was $10,000 to bring people into that area to live, which was great because they brought their spouses or partners and added to the workforce to that community in a really meaningful way. Now, they had to get through other pieces that were important, but it seems to me that there are creative ideas that other communities have worked, or regions or states. The other one too about universities, which I totally agree with. I think there's, at least in the entrepreneurship sector, there are things that can be done with technology transfer out of those universities that will allow new businesses to start around. You've seen coastal universities do it, Stanford and other really great schools that have spurned really great innovation and entrepreneurship in those communities by transferring technologies out of those universities in meaningful ways. And I think that's one area to lean into potentially.
Well, the great thing about those ecosystems in the higher ed institutions also is the fact that just because of the state they're located in, a lot of that work tends to be kind of extrapolating off of current industries, right?
Yeah.
So it's kind of helping build the future in the industries you already have a base in. So,
John, if I could hop in real quick, I've seen several questions about the base program in the chat, and just wanted to provide the timeline on that. The applications close on the 28th, so less than 2 weeks from now. We anticipate that awards would go out no sooner than March 25th, or award notifications would be made around that time. And unfortunately, that is really housed within the Department of Commerce. And I think that there's likely some proprietary information and things like that that would prohibit them from sharing, exactly what those applications are. So I don't know that we'll be able to provide that, but, we are working with them to make sure that if there are things that are duplicative, that we can make sure that they're not being funded in both places. So, we're working through that the best that we can, sort of within the parameters that have been laid out. Does that help answer the questions that everyone had around? Perfect.
all right, great. Let's move on to housing, just in the interest of time. And once again, we're not behind or anything like that. This is great discussion, which is what we need to have. So take 2 or 3 minutes, look at this, and then we can talk about the housing area. All right, who would like to kind of open up the discussion around housing?
This is Brad. Go ahead, Lana, because I think I'd like to hear what you have to say if you're going to respond to Tien's earlier questions.
All right, sorry. Yeah, so I would just say, there's a lot of talk around, do we have to build, lower cost houses, entry level homes? We hear that all the time. That is next to impossible to do. Building those units is very, very challenging. I would tell you most communities across Kansas, specifically all of our rural communities, the housing stock is old And we have people who definitely have the income levels to be living in a much more expensive home. We don't have those homes available. So one of the things that always tends to trip people up is they say, well, yeah, we need entry level housing, but you can't build that. We don't need to build that. You know, in a lot of these communities, and it's a really easy analysis to make. In our community alone, we just did a presentation to our builders last week. If we build the houses we need, those units are actually upwards of $200,000 a unit. We can build those. We can build those all day long today, even with supply chain issues, right? So the housing we need, about 3,000 units, right, in the next 8 years to accommodate just the growth that's happening today. We can build the units that we can actually get built today. But as we do that, we're opening up that older housing stock, that less costly housing stock. So that's one of the things I'd like us to keep our focus on. It's real easy to throw money at shoring up a project that brings in a whole bunch of lower demographic housing, but that's not the best impact for our state. The best impact for our state is to be growing our tax base while we're providing adequate housing. And I think it's important that we think about, let's build the houses that are best for our tax base, that allow people to move up to a house they can actually afford and should have been living in probably for some time. Let's free up their housing stock to take care of that other side.
Hey, Lana, where is kind of the market mechanism breaking down in terms of satisfying that need?
Sure, it's super easy to say supply and demand, right? That's the easiest economy we can have, is just, if you need it, you'll build it. Doesn't work that way for a couple of reasons. Obviously, we have things that are outside of the control of that piece of the economy itself. When we're talking about supply chain, for instance, being able to get materials at a reduced rate because you can buy in huge bulk. Those things happen all the time in metro areas. They don't happen all the time in rural communities. And the only way you can really make them happen in rural communities, those opportunities to really capitalize on cost savings and efficiencies, you have to increase the number of units being built at any given time. We look at a community like Garden City, we can support, again, we have a demand today of 3,000 additional housing units. So for us, it's pretty easy to get builders building and keep them moving. But there's no reason for them to go out and build in these outlying communities. And for my community, I've got 3,000 open positions in my community today. Those jobs are ready to go. Those are good paying, good jobs. For me, the best thing that can possibly happen is I get the worker, and the community, one county over or two counties over, gets the individual and their family, and they get them in their school district. And that's a tremendous benefit for my region, is when I can put folks out in these surrounding areas. But there is no housing available there, and there's no catalyst to get builders to go out to those surrounding counties and get those built up. So again, the biggest challenge is cost savings on materials and labor. Until we can meet the need. I have one framing crew that is just running crazy from job to job to job under every general, trying to keep up. So when you look out into the rural areas, those are the big challenges that are stopping us from having just a true supply demand, consistent feeding the market the way it needs to be fed.
Was somebody else going to ask a question? I didn't want to jump in front of.
This is Brett. I was just going to say, I attended one of the listening sessions that the executive committee had in Kansas City, Kansas. And there were probably 5 or 6 presenters from Saline County, from different entities and units of government, talking about this housing issue at that meeting. And they were talking about the need for housing to expand at Tony's and some of their other employers in that area. And kind of like Lona was saying, the explanation was that essentially the contractors that are going to build new apartment houses can build apartment houses that reap higher per square foot rents, say in Wichita or Oklahoma City or Kansas City, than they can in Salina. So the people just aren't showing up to build these projects. And meet the need they have, which was interesting for me to hear that gap wouldn't somehow be filled by contractors. And just a more general point as we go through these different categories, maybe something the staff or some of the economic development experts can help me with is, when we're thinking about these big catalytic projects and how to, which categories to focus on or projects to focus on and spending these dollars. If there's guidance on sort of, what types of investments, historically bring the greatest multiplier or have the greatest impact. Does investing in housing versus workforce development, where can you most efficiently invest those dollars to have the maximum impact? And I'm sure it's very complex because we have our own economy and ecosystem here and our certain set of needs that, has to be considered in doing that evaluation. Maybe the plan that you referenced again, John, the Commerce Department plan in terms of priorities for growth and investment has some of that sort of data that could help us as we look at some of these different subject areas. But that's my comment for the moment.
That's a fair ask, and we'll take a look at that. And there's certainly lots of examples of communities, in other states that have been able to grow significantly over time. And it's kind of what sequence did they go in when they thought about this? And there may not be only one model, but yeah, that's a tricky thing to get wrap our arms around.
Sorry, John. Brett, to piggyback off that comment, I would also add to that, I think the framework for growth plan, which is what we were alluding to there, is an important lens, but the statewide housing assessment that was just released, I think, is another one. And so I struggle with this housing section, not because I don't believe it's a need. I absolutely do. I struggle to know kind of what is the best way to be catalytic when I think not just all 105 counties and thousands of communities and incorporated places of the state has a need, but even in the larger areas. I know there's some portions of the Wichita Metro that are growing very fast, and some of our suburban communities have tons of new home builds. I know Johnson County, I'm sure, is the same way, but we even have elements in areas of Sedgwick County that don't have the housing that they want to see. And you don't have to go very far from downtown Wichita to see that. And then there's a gap sometimes of low to moderate income housing in places in our state. So I would really, as a committee member, feel, to me, this is the one area of getting our hands around the most of what is that catalytic way to help when I don't have clear line of sight on the other resources that the state is employing. I know the Rural Housing Incentive District program was just bulked up this year. Will that have a material dent in this issue? This is one that, to me, that it could be a quagmire if we're not careful.
Well, and I would just piggy onto that. We're talking about the impact of housing. Right. I think we're all kind of seeing it. We're seeing it through the lens, certainly, of increased workforce participation, being able to get more folks into the community. But the other thing, the numbers we ran and went through with our builders last week, if we build the estimated demand for Finney County, that's $220 million in profit to our builders. To the builders who get that construction done, you're talking about $220 million in additional income, private sector income. And that is the profit. That's based on their average profits per home. So we have to be sure we're looking at both sides of this. If we can create these opportunities, and especially if we can get, Kansas builders to come to the table and pick up some of this need, we're gonna stimulate the economy far more than just creating an opportunity to attract more workforce.
I have two questions, maybe more directed toward Lana. The first is, how do you view a category on this slide, like rental assistance, versus some of these other options? Do you view that as kind of a negative category? And the second question is, from what you said a few minutes ago, is there merit in exploring some type of a program that would leverage building supplies across multiple communities to achieve economies of scale and building materials? Like, that's not something probably, I I'm like Andrew. I don't know a lot about this this category, but it seems to me that if you can do something that could help dozens of communities by achieving economies of scale to then spur housing developments and builds, that could be a potentially positive thing.
Yeah, I agree 100%. So, to your first question, yeah, when I look at down payment assistance, rental assistance, I get it. Those, are certainly things that people know there's a demand for. I would also say there are other resources through which to accomplish those goals. But more importantly, I think from this committee standpoint, those are not long-term impact. Those they may be for the individuals who you're helping, but certainly not for the economy as a whole, if that's how, if that's the lens that we're choosing to view this through. So for me, I'm going to be far more attracted to the programs that will actually get additional units in the marketplace. And, again, some of those things will fix themselves: rental assistance, housing for seniors, down payment assistance. As we get additional housing stock and free up some of that lower price housing in our communities, that's going to start solving some of those other problems, right? If we can get us, right now, a rental in my community, you're paying as much here as they're paying on the Front Range of Colorado. That's where our price is, because that's where the market is, right? There's such a demand and there's such a limited supply that's what we can do. However, some of those rental units are very old stock and shouldn't be getting the price that they're able to get right now. So as we build additional units, and those are forced to kind of bring the cost back down into line with where it should be based on the investment in the actual facilities, that's going to improve the opportunities, in the rental area and housing for seniors and even down payment. If we're lowering the cost of a new house by creating this lower stock, you're going to have more opportunities for folks to enter into the housing market and the homeownership world.
Great points with that. I'm going to suggest we have two more kind of areas. One of them, the last one, being a little bit of a catch-all. So I'd suggest we move to slide 15. Give people a little bit of time to absorb the water area. But one thing I'll just state here too is, hopefully it's becoming obvious that there are going to be, trying to kind of peanut butter across all of these areas in terms of the focus and in terms of the funding is going to be pretty difficult. It's getting to kind of areas to really hone in on to make a difference on. Personally, the panel can go wherever it wants to go, but I think that is probably going to be something that's going to be important for success. That being said, let's go to 335, looking at this area. I don't know how much expertise we have in the group around this, but we certainly got a lot of submissions. So.
This is Tim. Is this also another one of those areas where there's actually a committee at the state level that is helping provide funding and allocation for this, similar to like the Commerce Department's BASE program?
Representative Tarwater would probably know better than I, but I would have to believe there has to be an agency somewhere looking at this.
Well, we do have, we've got a water committee, and they're putting together a new water plan for the state. That has a lot to do though with what water we have left to work with and farming communities. We also have, and JR can speak to this too. We've got committees that look at infrastructure quite a bit, and there is a lot of the stuff that's in our state budget as it is. Mm-hmm. A lot of these submissions, as I was going through, are several of them anyway, are to supplement projects that we've already given incentives to, business incentives, to move there. And part of that was the state gives a lot of money for infrastructure, and then the locals have to match 20% of it or whatever it is in order to accommodate the business that's moving. And now they're asking for their 20% in this, when they come into the, this spreadsheet thing. So we need to take a close look at it, I think, make sure that we're not double dipping, which a lot of this seems to be. JR?
I concur. Um, yeah, there are several areas where it looks like we have some duplication, and just reading through, I only made it about 80 in to the submissions, and seeing some of them that were we had already paid a share, or sometimes I found some things where like transportation already has a program and they could be funded with a local match. There were several that looked like they had, like you said, business incentives that were attached to them. But there were also some really good ones in there. I thought there were some that address, like this one has on it, the sewer and water upgrades for housing. There were a few good ones in there for that, where I think that could make a huge dent in the housing issue, which we have as well. And as you mentioned earlier, one of our guests on here, Saline County, and the problems that we're having here with the number of jobs that we have coming online over the next 3 years in aviation, the Kubota plant, and the Schwann's facility. There's just nowhere for people to live. And one of the requests we have is in housing, but there's also a couple of other ones, like, you know, Lana had mentioned it too. It's really hard to build the housing that you need. So it maybe makes sense to open that housing up by building the units that open up the units you need. So we have some discussion in there about university housing. Our 2 universities have increased enrollment, which has taken too many units offline in the community, and then senior housing, where we could move some seniors into senior living that's just not available right now. So their occupying housing might be less expensive for families to move into who are coming in from outside the community. So lots of options there. I think the water and sewer, though, could go a long way towards that, just in looking at how that played out in some of the submissions, where they're trying to get not necessarily the things that you would pay specials for, but those connective roads where it opens up large tracts of land for housing. But that road wouldn't be one that's paid for by the homeowners necessarily. It could be paid for by something like Spark, or at least the water sewer upgrades for it could be.
I agree with that.
I don't want to occupy everyone's time. We get to talk about this all day, so a lot of others speak.
I agree with that. I think that if we did have a better infrastructure, sewer and road program to open up areas, you just got to be careful that you're not benefiting one company or business over another. Spend a bunch of money to help a developer develop their own land without having other people participate could be an issue.
Yeah, and to the point that you made, I think undoubtedly there are communities that need to make upgrades to allow for growth. But I think one of the things I would be concerned with would be that what if it's communities that have just put off making the investments that they needed to make. The other side of that is, if they are truly opening it up, then it's going to create additional housing. That housing generates property tax, and communities need to be mindful that it's on them to keep their community livable. And certainly that's a responsibility of local government. If you're going to try to support growth, you have to maintain what you have, instead of trying to, always look for the free program, if you will, to go rebuild your community because you simply weren't taking care of it. Nobody insures you for that. That's your job, to make sure that you're utilizing your resources appropriately.
So that's a good. That reminds me of a question and I think you're the best person here to answer that, Lana. In the current governor's budget, she has over $100 million in there for housing of one sort or another. How would you envision, or how would you, if you were her advisor, how would you advise her to spend that best in order to actually spur housing developments?
Yeah, again, I think, to me, it's really all about getting the builders out of their comfort zone, getting them out of those primary markets and out into the tertiary and secondary and tertiary markets. And I may be the wrong person to ask. So sorry, because I don't believe in just giving the cash away, right? I think it needs to be the gap financing. I think it needs to be the piece that solidifies the deal. But, in some cases, certainly when you're looking out in those rural communities, as you're building higher cost homes, there's going to be issues with appraisals, simply because there have not been historical sales of that level of home for so long because it hasn't been available. So those are the kind of areas I'd like to see those funds really focus on, is shoring up the gaps, if you will, to build what we actually need and what's actually going to contribute to the ad valorem tax base of our communities. That's what matters. If we can grow those tax bases, especially in my area, you're talking about a lot of communities who have lost oil and gas revenues. For some of those communities, that's over a third of the revenues that they had. That revenue just came, right? They never had to worry about it. They didn't have to pay for any roads. They didn't have to do any infrastructure to keep it going. And quite frankly, they haven't done anything to put themselves in a position to save themselves from those losses. So the only way we do that is to invest in things that truly are going to grow the tax base of our state and increase the value, for all of our citizenry, as well as the quality of life. I think that's important to people. A lot of these communities have very old housing stock, and when we're talking about folks who are truly trying to get to the heartland, they're trying to relocate here from the coastal areas and from a lot of the urban areas. We have to have the quantity and the quality of housing that they're looking for if we intend to attract them and get them here. So if she were asking me that question, I would tell you, let's put that money where there's already a significant amount of private investment involved, where the community's already in the game. And what we're doing is stepping in to shore up those gaps to ensure that it's a long-term gain, not a short-term benefit.
Well, with that, great discussion here, by the way. Let's move on to
John, before we
go
do,
ahead.
just one quick comment.
Sure.
We've talked about maybe some state resources, but then there's also federal resources for water infrastructure projects too. So it might be helpful to understand, like, of these over 100, right, that were submitted, which of these categories might generally fit traditional infrastructure projects that would, I think WIFIA is the acronym. Are there projects that could otherwise apply for and get support through a federal program? And just kind of weigh that as we consider these types of projects as well.
Okay, good. Yeah, we'll look into that. So the next category is other enablers. And take a look at that until maybe like 3:45. We're going to discuss. This is a broad area. When I looked at this, I thought this was all the things that didn't necessarily fit in the other areas. So it was kind of the all else bucket in a little bit. But take a look, and then we can have some discussions around it. So when we open it back up for discussion, I think the game plan would be, given the time, maybe about 5 minutes or 5 minutes plus of discussion on this slide. And then in the remaining time, really spend some time kind of revisiting how we think about even now the filtering process. And that'll even get a little bit into the prioritization process. And then talk about some next steps. So, just make sure we don't kind of shortchange those things. I know it looks like we have a lot of slides left, but really it's not a lot once we get past this. So with that, I'd open it up. I mean, this is a pretty broad category of things. Any kind of reactions to some of the things here? Any thoughts?
I think these are going to be ones that just require us to really dig into them and see how they fit with what we're doing. Just at first blush, I have to say, things like building new buildings or building, I saw on an earlier screen, building incubators, those kind of things. Those are kind of spray and pray economic development. I would want to make sure that those are actually, we have an end user in place and that end user is contributing to this. We're not building this and then letting them just come in for nothing, so that those are going to be challenging for me. I think they're going to take a lot of review to determine if they fit our long-term goal.
Mm-hmm.
I'll go next.
Go ahead,
Ryan.
I said it on the workforce filter as well. It looks like we've got a lot of governmental entities that have put in something in this one as well. So again, if it's base, if it's other programs out there, just to make sure that we're not duplicating efforts is one thing that I would flag.
Mm-hmm. Yep. You're already getting at how we may think about filtering.
Yeah, I'll just add that this is another category. Yeah, it's admittedly kind of a tough because it's kind of a catch-all. I look at it in a couple different ways. I can see infrastructure kind of being diminished in our eyes, and as we look at think of being catalytic. But I go back to kind of the framework for growth plan and what are those pieces that are required or needed to propel some of our industries forward. I think there could be some infrastructure like things. So that's where where my mind goes initially. And then kind of the renovations. I know I skimmed the list, but a number of kind of historic buildings, historic theaters could be really impactful for sure. But I struggle to know, is that kind of just kind of fixing patching kind of a quality of life amenity. But that being said, public spaces, some of these recreation elements, those things are quality of life. Those things attract talent. And to Lana's great point earlier about we need more talent in this state. You cannot divorce those things. You cannot divorce these quality of life amenities in small communities and in the biggest community, Wichita, of attracting talent. So yeah, I'm gonna struggle with this. The food systems and other category I'm a little less sure about, but those quality of life amenities could be really a kind of game changers for us.
Mm-hmm. Any other thoughts?
When it comes to infrastructure, we have a pretty robust plan that we put together a few years ago, and there's new projects announced every day. The budget for KDOT is, over $1.5 billion. And so
2.1.
Yeah.
2.1.
2.1. Yeah, I was looking at 21 right now, but yeah. And it goes up every year quite a bit. So, there's, again, a lot of money that's already being put out there for a lot of these things. So.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I'll
Anything
come back
that
for a second bite at the apple. Maybe more formatting or how I go through the Excel spreadsheet. But I think particularly on this subcategory, I'd be curious where the local cost share is. As I read through the guiding principles, it's combined with local leverage and agency funds to maximize the use of discretionary funds.
Yep.
I don't know if there's a tabulation within the spreadsheet that volunteers what the locals are willing to throw in on their application on this particular subcategory.
I don't believe there is. I think they're asked to talk about whether there are other funds that could be leveraged, but not a number there at this point.
That may be a column that could be added, and staff could try to quantify in a column based on responses. If it is a quantifiable response, to Ryan's point, might be helpful.
Yeah, I mean, and there are 2 points there, right? There's if things could be better covered by other sources of funds or in other plans, let them be covered there, right? To the extent that it requires a partnership, make sure that there's cost sharing. So there's probably both things to think about. Now that we've come to the end of all of these, are there any categories of things people expected to see and didn't see? Or maybe that might be more appropriate once you've had a chance to kind of go through the submissions.
Yeah, this may get it. I think it was Matt's point kind of at the beginning of our discussion today around ideas that are so large and transformative that they may not originate from somebody who would submit an application via this form. And are we positioned to raise the right questions and explore all of those types of options? And at the same time, I think it was Lana who said, ensure that we're giving appropriate response and due diligence to the actual applications that did come in, kind of balancing those two needs.
Yeah, and that is the challenge. I mean, if you go to the next slide, we almost put this in here a little bit to kind of remind people of the exercise, right? The real exercise is, and we didn't even know what the exact number was going to be of all the submissions at this point, but really thinking through, how do we ensure the investments and, it's going to require honing in, foster a long-term systemic impact, in the most important areas, through one-time investments that have catalytic impacts on a broad scale. And I take the point before about, you got to look at geographic equity and what might be important for different parts of Kansas as well. But, there's going to be no lack of places to make investments here. Really thinking about the things for this particular set of funds that would fit, that will make the biggest catalytic impact, I think is going to be the challenge and the opportunity. And so next we can talk a little bit about filtering, because people have been talking about things that have been filtering related. That was potentially, if we had the time, doing another exercise with that collaboration board. And I don't think that's in the cards. And I think we had a lot of great discussion on the filtering slide. Next one. Could you go to the next slide? Great, that's it. So, as we think about all of these opportunities, and we've already, the team has begun filtering just against, some of the submissions that against a hard filter around allowability, they would never be allowed, right? And so in those cases, already start put down, not allowable or always allowable or sometimes or depends. But obviously one filter is, could it ever be made allowable? But then you start getting into some other potential filtering criteria. And the question is, they may not be filters or they may be filters, depending upon how you want to approach it. But they certainly could weigh a lot. So alternate funding, can we fund with other dollars? Is it just not within this sweet spot? Or is there an existing program in place that really already covers this, right? And is the investment type, is this a one-time, is a catalytic investment, or is it an ongoing investment, something that creates a cliff? My guess is if there are some things like that, the Spark Executive Committee, at the very least, even if this panel doesn't do it, it sounds like your all heads are there as well, wouldn't look too favorably on it. And then the funding scale, I don't know if I'd call it the funding scale, but it's a little bit of, do you think it's going to be a big enough catalytic or enabler, big enough idea or not? So I guess I just open it up now. We touched upon a lot of these things as we've gone through. We need to kind of make sure that we look at all the submissions, but as you think about the categories, and this is even putting aside coming up with our own ideas as a panel around, some big ideas, how are you guys thinking about, if you were going to kind of filter in or maybe even group some of the things that came in, what criteria you'd use?
John, this goes back, and I think a lot of people have said it. To me, I'm going to go through this list, and if it's short term, there's a lot of short term, and there's a lot of short term things on here. To me, I think I can eliminate quite a few, personally.
Yep.
Yeah, I think this is actually a fairly comprehensive list to what I'm going to be looking for, but I would agree with what was said earlier. The local or the private investment is another piece of that that's going to be important for me to determine whether or not it's an investment we should be looking at.
Mm-hmm.
I tend to agree with Matt as far as making investments that will have a return on investment so that we can have somewhat of a evergreen effect to these funds. And of course, they're not going to come back to a Spark committee, but they're going to come back to the SGF fund, the state general fund, and it'll be an increase in revenue. And so that we'll be able to take some of that revenue and continue projects like this in the future. So kind of an evergreen type fund.
Great. Anything else? I'm assuming it's been said so many times before, but making the investment a catalytic investment, right? Not incurring kind of ongoing costs, unless maybe it's totally outweighed in terms of the evergreen aspect to it.
It feels to me too, and again, we all go through this different pathway, but just topically, like looking at investments, and maybe it's how we all organize in our own brain, but the key terms that keep coming out are the key ideas, and there's probably others too, but agriculture, I think education, housing, obviously, which I'm learning about, renewable energy, and kind of this innovation ecosystem. It seems like the big ideas need to speak to those elements in really meaningful ways, probably collectively, because I think, Lana brings up, I'm not as tied into the housing situation, but it makes sense to me that it's a core problem that we have to get to if we're going to bring businesses and drive the economy here. And so I guess that's what I keep coming back to, this idea of what are the really big catalytic ideas in those sectors. Maybe there's one or two more that I don't know about or not thinking about, but trying to find where those are. And again, as Representative Tarwater brought up, it seems to me that's our job to think about how we do these is not like one-time investments, but things that spur additional revenue so that we can keep them moving forward and growing.
Yep.
And so, at least for me, as I kind of get this all figured out, it might take me. I'm trying to get there.
Yeah, particularly for this panel, economic revitalization. If there's one of the panels where you're going to have something that could be evergreen, this is it. So, well, just being respectful of everyone's time, let's go to slide 25. So in terms of next steps, great discussion. Some of what we had talked about doing here was, building out. We're going to continue to be going through the submissions, and particularly from an allowability standpoint. And it would be great if everyone on the panel could do that as well. We're also going to start working through, getting ready kind of for the next step in the process. But for each one of those programmatic areas, we'll look at the submissions, but also begin understanding, how some of these things could group into programmatic areas. This is going to be something that the support team is going to take a stab at, a cut at, but look for engagement with panelists from the exit survey, depending upon your areas of interest. One thing, though, that I don't think in terms of the next steps that, frankly, we've planned out explicitly enough is the things that we can do to help the panel get at the catalytic ideas, the big transformative ideas. And I'll just say there, we need to put a little bit of thought into that ourselves about some things we could bring to bear and work with the panel on around that, because it sounds like there's some appetite there for that for sure. Something that I'd agree with as well. And we need to put a little thought into that about next steps around that. So, and any thoughts anyone on the panel has around resources or ideas, and the panel can keep creating and submitting ideas themselves, right? Even though that submission to the public is closed, the intent is that the panel itself is going to be zeroing in as well as brainstorming their own ideas. So we're going to have the exit survey go out. We're going to be looking to work with folks on these, but at the same time, we're going to be putting a little bit of thought into kind of how to get at that transformative catalytic discussion, and any ideas there would be welcome. So I guess with that, just in closing, any thoughts, suggestions from anyone?
I just want to point out that we can bubble up several ideas. It doesn't have to just be one or two big, huge catalytic type things. We could talk about workforce development. We can talk about housing. Just be mindful that we can submit several ideas.
Yep, exactly. Well, and from the standpoint of the support team, I mean, that recommendation is all the panels, right? We just want to support the panel in doing that. So really, and any requests or direction that you have outside of this, we are happy to move down that path. So,
Don, this is kind of a technical request, but maybe on the spreadsheet, I'm just aware that it sounds like there may be some work done to bring more quantitative analysis to that, being able to do additional filtering. If we could have maybe maybe it's on there and I'm just not seeing it on my spreadsheet, but if we could have a numbering system assigned to each of the requests, so that if we're making notes in here and as we have different iterations of the spreadsheet with additional columns being built out, that we can take maybe our individual notes that we're developing and just copy those onto iterative versions of this as additional columns are being built. That might be helpful to be able to have them sorted in the same order.
all right, I'll let the support team folks who are working on that kind of noodle that through. Great, thanks. Reasonable request. But any other thoughts? Closing thoughts, Representative Tarwater?
Lana, would you be able to put together your thoughts on how that stopgap type thing would work for housing projects?
Yeah, for sure.
If we don't end up doing a whole lot in this committee, I can certainly bring it to the appropriations committee, because there's over $100 million in the governor's budget, and it might be some of the things you said are things that we have not discussed, and we've kind of just glossed those things over for now. And so I've learned a lot today, and I appreciate that. Thank you.
Absolutely. I'll be happy to put those together for you. Thank you.
Great. Well, with that, thank you very much for spending your Friday afternoon with all of us. Really appreciate it. And, got a lot of work to do, and we're going to get at it to try and help support the team here. Thank you.
Hey, John, do we have the next meeting scheduled? I'm sorry.
I'd have to ask, did we schedule the next meeting? I know that we haven't sent out a schedule appointment, but we've begun looking at availability there.
Yeah, our tentative day is March 2nd. I think we're just still confirming that, and we'll be sending out a meeting invite as soon as it's confirmed.
Yeah, it would be helpful for me to go ahead and get them scheduled more than one at a time, just because even that spreadsheet I submitted a few weeks ago, I didn't block out all that time on my calendar. Things I told you I was available for 2 weeks ago, I may not be available for now. So So, and I'm going to try to prioritize this whenever I can, but
Yeah.
be helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, I know my wife would appreciate it too, so I definitely am there with you.
Well, yeah, I totally agree with Brett. And I think that I agree, some of us aren't available now for time we put out there before. You know,
Yeah,
like March
okay.
2nd, I know I'm not
We'll,
available.
we'll revisit. Yeah.
I love
To
that.
follow the lead of our senator and our chairman, I concur. I would agree.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. Have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.